What are the specific things that increase our risk of getting Alzheimer's disease and dementia? What are the top 4 habits that you can do to mitigate your risk so that you don't have to lose your memory as you get older? Today, you'll find out. Alzheimer's was once believed to be determined by your genetics, but now it's believed that genetics may only contribute to 10% of the overall risk of Alzheimer's disease. Dr. Tommy Wood is one of the foremost neuroscientists studying what leads to Alzheimer's and, more importantly, what can be done to mitigate risk and avoid it. In today's episode, you're going to learn about specific factors that increase your risk of Alzheimer's and specific habits to implement to greatly reduce your risk. Dr. Tommy Wood is a celebrated neuroscientist, a researcher, athletic performance coach to world champion athletes, and author of the forthcoming book, Future-Proof Your Brain, which will offer timely expertise and takeaway related to brain health, cognition, focus, and more at any age. He's an assistant professor of pediatrics and neuroscience at the University of Washington, where his laboratory focuses on brain health across the lifespan. You guys, if this is your first time here, make sure you hit follow on the Apple Podcast app or on Spotify. And if you're watching on YouTube, click subscribe down below because we're continuing to come out with some of the most life-changing content that there is. But for now, it's time to get closer and closer to your best you with the one and only Dr. Tommy Wood. What's up, everybody, and welcome back to the Best You podcast. Today, I'm really excited to be joined by the one and only Dr. Tommy Wood. Tommy, really excited today to dive into brain health, and in particular to dive into things like dementia and things like Alzheimer's. I'm also, I know it's not out yet, but I'm really excited for your forthcoming book called Future-Proof Your Brain. I know that brain health is something that is, I think, increasingly getting more and more attention and something that people are becoming more and more mindful of and are more and more putting specific things into practice. And so today I want to talk about really specific things to future-proof your brain, like your book is going to be called. So the way I want to start off today is simply, what is your sense of how much of dementia and Alzheimer's is actually preventable versus how much is just determined by what your genes are?
Yeah, that's a great question. Historically, we've kind of thought that dementia is this thing that we essentially have no control over, and especially if people in our family have had it, it's like baked into our genes, and it's almost this inevitable thing that we don't have the ability to change. And thankfully, that really doesn't seem to be the case. Genetics. So I guess I'll zoom out quickly and say there are two. If we're talking about dementia, dementia has multiple different types. The most common is Alzheimer's dementia or Alzheimer's disease, and that's probably the one we're talking about most today. Although some of the other dementias, like vascular dementia, which is when you essentially get lots of mini strokes in your brain that over time create this picture of dementia, the risk factors for these other dimensions also overlap with Alzheimer's disease and dementia. So we can kind of think of them together in some way. But when we think about Alzheimer's disease, there's one type that is driven by genetics. Early onset Alzheimer's disease, it's, maybe just 1 or 2% of all the Alzheimer's disease that we see. It's single mutations that do occur in families or can happen spontaneously. And so that is driven by genetics, and that in reality is a separate disease. Late onset Alzheimer's disease, which is the vast majority of Alzheimer's and what people are probably experiencing in themselves and loved ones, or that they're worried about, that maybe about 10% of your total risk is determined by genetics. And so then the way to flip that is to say more than 90% of your risk is determined by factors that we can change. So depending on who you ask, there have been these big formal commissions and bodies who have sat down and reviewed the literature. And essentially it seems that at the low end, some say 40% is preventable. At the high end, some people are saying 70% or more. So in reality, probably the majority of Alzheimer's is preventable. And actually, even in those estimates, there are some risk factors that they haven't always taken into account. So I think if we addressed everything, we would be on the high end. 70, 80% of dementia or more could be preventable. with various changes to environment, lifestyle, and some societal stuff as well that we can talk about if you want.
Yeah, for sure. And we're going to dive into a lot of those things and probably deeply into some of them more than others. But real quickly, before we move to some of that stuff, early onset Alzheimer's versus late onset Alzheimer's. Is there like an age where there's like a cutoff? Is it like 60 and below is kind of what you would consider early onset versus 60 and above with late onset, or is there a particular cutoff?
It's not perfect. And I certainly know some clinicians who say that even in individuals who have the mutations for early onset Alzheimer's disease, they're able to really slow that process with, again, lifestyle change. But in general, we think about early onset Alzheimer's disease kind of starts in your 30s to 50s, and it's a fairly sort of steady decline from there. Late onset Alzheimer's, it's more like late 60s, 70s, 80s, and it's more heterogeneous, it's more variable. Like sometimes you'll see these big changes in function, sometimes you'll sort of stay the same for long periods of time. But that's kind of how you separate them out.
Okay, cool. Okay, so let's go into some of those environmental, lifestyle, societal type changes. Now, I think some of the ones that I'm going to kind of throw out, basically 5 different things where there's like sleep, nutrition, exercise, stress. And when I say stress, I mean kind of bad stress, mental, emotional stress, trauma, those sorts of things. And then also like challenging yourself cognitively as like 5 different things that you can focus on to improve your brain health over time. If I had to like make you rank 1 through 5 or like whatever other ones that you would say are like the highest leverage activities to really focus on that can give you maximal improvement in brain health or maximal decrease in risk of dementia or Alzheimer's dementia, then how would you kind of go about maybe ranking some of those?
Yeah, so when you gave your list, I was like, great, we don't have to have this podcast. You already know the answer. That's fantastic. So which and you included my favorite one, which is what I'm going to talk about the most, which is demand or challenge and how you use the brain. And I think that's number 1. And then I'm probably going to put sleep number 2, but in reality, it's like a joint number 2 between the next 4 for the reasons that I'll tell you now. When I think about the brain, and there's vast amounts of research that kind of come together in this idea, but the brain is essentially just like a muscle. So the way you would think about building a brain and maintaining cognitive function is exactly the same as if you wanted to build strength and muscle mass. So if you're trying to get stronger in the gym, you're trying to get bigger, you're trying to get more jacked, the most important thing you can do is lift weights, right? The challenge, the mechanical tension on the muscle is the critical component that drives how much strength and muscle you gain. If you want to like optimize that process, you need nutrition, right? You need adequate protein, probably some micronutrients, things like that. You know, and actually overall cardiovascular health helps as well, like helps recovery during sets and some other things. And then you need to provide the time for that muscle to grow and recover, right? So then we're talking about sleep. And essentially the brain is exactly the same. So if you want to improve cognitive function, and we see this in multiple ways in terms of how cognitive function improves early in life as we challenge the brain when we're kids, and then as we go into formal education, you know, for the first 2 or 3 decades of our life, basically our job is to learn. And as we do that, cognitive function increases. Then after that, later in life, we see that the more cognitively challenged you are, like the more you're doing with your brain, the slower the rate of decline, essentially. And you can even improve cognitive function very late in life if you challenge the brain. So number 1 is do difficult things with your brain, because that improves function. And we can talk about what that looks like. But then if you want to optimize that process, I have 2 other buckets, as I call them. So I call them support and supply. And supply is 2 or 3 main things. So the first one is you need a healthy cardiovascular system, because when the brain is active, it draws more blood to that area to provide oxygen, nutrients, and, you know, glucose or ketones or lactate or whatever it is your brain is running on energetically at the time. And for that to work, you need a healthy vascular system, cardiovascular system. You also need healthy metabolism, right, to be able to supply say glucose, so the brain can function. And then you also need certain nutrients that are used as the building blocks of new neurons and synapses and connections and all those things in the brain. And that's important things like long chain omega-3 fatty acids, choline that you get from eggs, B vitamins, really important. So these nutrients are critical. And then the other part that I call support, that's mainly giving the time to rest and recover. And like that's when adaptation actually occurs, just like when you're in the gym. So sleep is critical, but then you also want to avoid things that inhibit that process. So stress, chronic stress is one of them, but then other things like high amounts of alcohol, smoking, like pollution plays a big role here. Chronic inflammation can do this, and we know that dental disease is a very common cause of that. It creates this chronic inflammatory response in the body that can negatively impact the brain. So those are my three buckets, and the reason why I put your other four as kind of like a joint number two is because in different people, those different things matter to a different extent, right? You may be really on top of your sleep, but your diet could be improved, or you're not doing as much physical activity to improve your cardiovascular health, or you're doing a bunch of exercise, but unfortunately, usually people who exercise don't smoke, but some people do both, right? So there may be something else, or the sort of the rate limiting step in terms of adapting to challenge in the brain is different in different people. So I don't like to rank them because then people can just address what they need to address for themselves.
Right. No, that's such a great framework, those three different kind of categories through which to kind of move forward with this conversation, and through which to just kind of like conceptualize it on your own when you're working through some of these different things. So let's start with cognitive challenge. I know that, a lot of people think when they're older, doing crossword puzzles, doing things like Sudoku and doing mental exercises like that are going to be beneficial. But I think what I have learned a lot that it really needs to be a little bit more demanding than that. And maybe there's going to be a direct correlation between the complexity of the cognitive challenge and the benefit to the actual brain. Talk to us about what an appropriate cognitive challenge would actually look like for us when we're maybe starting to get older and starting to think about how we can more challenge ourselves cognitively when we're maybe not experiencing that on a regular basis through work because we're retired or something like that.
So I think it's helpful to start with what like the typical person looks like. And like I said, when you finish education and you go into your job, whatever that is, generally, even in like complex, highly skilled jobs, which you might think would be cognitively demanding, you tend to specialize, right? So imagine you become a surgeon. You don't want surgery to be a significant cognitive challenge, right? You want it to become automatic. You want everything to just happen, right? And you develop that complex skill. But then the thing is that as you're using that skill, you're no longer challenging your brain in the same way. And even if we do jobs where we feel busy, like we feel that our brain is being used because we're constantly multitasking, we have all these different things, actually that's not stimulating the brain in the same way. There is evidence that the level of stimulus you get from your work is protective, but in general, we tend to just do the same things again and again and again in our jobs. And then the point at which cognitive function seems to accelerate in terms of decline is retirement, like you mentioned. And the earlier you retire, in general, the earlier you get Alzheimer's disease, or the more likely you are to get Alzheimer's disease, because you've removed that one main cognitive stimulus, which is your work. There's some interesting evidence around things like crossword puzzles and Sudoku, and they don't challenge the brain in the way that I'm talking about, but they can be beneficial because they're more like a meditation or mindfulness kind of task in terms of what's being activated and done in the brain. So that can be good for stress management and these other things, but it's not stimulating the brain in the same way. So what we're really talking about is complex skills, and learning complex skills and practicing things that we're currently bad at. There's a whole range of things that you could do that fit into this bucket. So learning new languages, learning new sports, particularly what we call open skill sports, where you're like part of a team or you're reacting to the environment, like a ball sport, tennis, badminton, but also other coordinative sports seem to do a similar thing, or coordinative exercise like yoga. But then you could fit in skateboarding and surfing, and right, these things where you're challenging your balance as well as your cardiovascular system. Those seem to be really fantastic. So it's these kind of human activities, these complex motor skills, languages, music. Those are really the things that seem to challenge the brain, and you're activating multiple parts of the brain at the same time in terms of these coordinative activities, which seems to be really beneficial. So then when you're trying to do that, if you're really learning a skill in the right way, it should be difficult. And when we do that, you can probably only do it for like, maybe 20 to 30 minutes at a time, like really pushing the edges of your current skills. And that's regardless of it's music or language or sport. And then, you need some periods to recover, but you can only really focus on a task that you're learning for a short period of time. So those are the kinds of skills. And there are lots that I haven't mentioned, but it's those things where you're sort of spending time really pushing the edges of your current capacity. And, maybe it's something you can only do for a maximum of 30, 60, 90 minutes. And then, you would come back to it a day or two later and slowly improve over time.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, and like you said, I think one of the important things is to remember is, like you said, you're not always like pushing yourself at the edge of your current capacity, at the edge of your limits. I kind of almost think of that as one way to apply kind of like the 80-20 rule, is like 80% of the time kind of spend in your wheelhouse, 20% of the time be pushing your limits and be pushing your current capacity. Is there any science or data that shows difference between something like, we mentioned sports, we mentioned maybe like playing an instrument or something like that, movement-based things? Is there similar benefits or same benefits or more benefits from something like, I want to research a subject and then write a book about it, or I want to paint a new piece of artwork? Are there similar benefits to those types of cognitive challenges?
Yeah, they haven't really been compared next to one another in those same ways. You kind of, for each grouping, and it's say languages, so people who either learn new languages or people who are bilingual, musicians, and then obviously science research, these other ways that we stimulate the brain. They haven't really been compared head to head. So you could maybe say, well, you're activating different parts of the brain with these different activities. So maybe it's good to do 2 or 3 of them, right? So maybe you learn a new language and you also take up a dance class or something like that, and then you're really covering all your bases. What they have shown is that most of the benefit comes from the point where you're bad at it and you're learning. So there was this really nice paper that came out a few years ago. They used this technology this MRI scan and machine learning algorithm called brain age. And it's basically, you have an MRI scan and then you ask the algorithm, how old does this brain look in terms of like biologically, how old does it look? And they found that compared to non-musicians, musicians had younger looking brains, regardless of their chronological age. But the benefit was even greater in amateur musicians compared to professional musicians. And the idea being that for amateur musicians, it's harder, right? It's more of a challenge for the brain. So because these things haven't been compared side by side, the way I usually think about it is pick something that's challenging and, includes some of these various skills, be they movement or language or music or something like that. And it's something that you enjoy and you want to get better at. And the reason why I say that is because it means you're more likely to do it. And that's really the most important thing, is something you're bad at that you want to get better at, that you can spend time working on. And I think that's really the most important part.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I love this. I could talk about cognitive challenge all day long, but I think I'm going to go to one of the support sides of things when it comes to sleep. Now, I'm going to give a quick little brief, overly simplistic overview, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think it's my understanding that REM sleep, of the two different again, to simplify it further, two different stages of sleep, REM sleep and non-REM sleep. If REM sleep, from what I understand, is kind of responsible for encoding the memories, and then non-REM sleep is what moves it to a different part of the brain, committing it to more longer-term memory. And then I also know that non-REM sleep just traditionally declines, or our ability to get non-REM sleep traditionally declines as we get older. So I guess first question is, do I have that right? Second question is there any particular ways where we can focus on improving our ability to get non-REM sleep as we get older, or can we like look at it specifically through the lens of getting better at getting one type of sleep more regularly?
So in general, I don't think there's any really good evidence that we can sort of hack our different sleep states to that, in that specific way. Some people are working on, like versions of binaural beats that may cause entrainment of delta waves that kind of may enhance non-REM sleep. And that stuff is super interesting. We're not really there yet. However, broadly, what you said is absolutely right. And there are two main takeaways that I think everybody can apply. So when you activate different parts of the brain, and this has been shown in humans in various ways, when you specifically activate a certain part of the brain. So if you activate, if you restrict movement or activate movement in a certain, say, limb or part of the body, the part of the motor cortex that controls that part of the body, if it's moved, you stimulate more deep sleep during sleep in an area of the brain that has been stimulated during the day, if that makes sense. So if you want more deep sleep, one of the best ways to create, or the drive for deep sleep, is to challenge the brain. And that area of the brain that becomes challenged will have more deep sleep type structures during sleep. And I say that because different parts of the brain can be in different parts of sleep at the same time, right? Your whole brain isn't in non-REM, and then your whole brain isn't in REM. They can actually, happen at different times in different parts of the brain. So deep sleep, or non-REM sleep, is stimulated at least partly by cognitive challenge. So that's something that we can do. And then REM sleep, it in particular happens towards the end of the night. So one of the most important things you can do to increase your REM sleep is to sleep longer, right? Give yourself more opportunity to spend more time in bed. So those are usually the two main takeaways that I have. One is challenge your brain, and exercise definitely plays a role here as well, because we know that exercise improves sleep quality. So challenge your brain, and then give yourself enough time in bed to have the sleep opportunity to have all those different periods of sleep as your brain needs it.
I love it. Yeah. And that non-REM sleep is not something that I've heard before. So that was good to hear, that basically if you are challenging your body in you're challenging your body in a new way, that's putting cognitive stress or cognitive challenge on your brain, basically, for lack of better terms, lighting up a different area of your brain that also needs to essentially like recover and needs non-REM sleep after it that night. So you're more likely to get more.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Gotcha. That's awesome. Next thing I'm really excited to get into, because I've never really heard brain health as much talked about it through this way, is you talked about a healthy cardiovascular system being really important, and the importance of essentially having healthy blood flow and not having high blood pressure and hypertension and stuff like that. And I've also seen you discuss the importance of homocysteine levels as it relates to your omega-3 levels, your DHA and your EPA. I want you to just kind of discuss all of those things framed up to frame up the conversation with regards to healthy cardiovascular system, homocysteine levels, blood pressure, omega-3, and kind of frame up the conversation, because I know it's a big one, but I know it's really important.
Yeah, so like all of those fit into that supply bucket that I mentioned earlier. And we can start with the first, which is a healthy cardiovascular system. And I think one of the main reasons this is important, one is because I mentioned earlier, there's a type of dementia called vascular dementia, which is where you basically have these like mini clots that happen in the brain, and those can accumulate over time and cause dementia. And actually, vascular dementia and Alzheimer's disease often happen at the same time, essentially because they're very similar risk factors. And so that, the healthy vascular system is essential to minimize that from happening. But more broadly, when you activate a certain part of the brain, there's this thing called neurovascular coupling, which is basically the activity of neurons expands the blood vessels in that area so that you draw in more blood flow and oxygen to that part of the brain so it can be more active. However, in order for that to happen, you need those blood vessels to be kind of supple and healthy and responsive. And those are the responses that you lose if you have high blood pressure or if you have long-standing cardiovascular disease. There's this like old cliche which says what's good for the heart is good for the brain, and that's essentially why. So there are studies that show that even like cardiovascular exercise, even late in life, and improving cardiovascular fitness, again, even late in life, even in your 50s and 60s, you can slow your rate of cognitive decline and your risk of dementia by improving your cardiovascular health. And that's probably one reason why. Then there are others like myokines and supportive factors like brain-derived neurotrophic factor that you release when you exercise that can support the brain. So there's multiple reasons why, but one is you've improved the health of the blood vessels, including in the brain. Then, if you want to build new connections in the brain, or you're trying to turn over cells, and we're constantly like replenishing and repairing things throughout the body, including in the brain, then you need the basic structure of those cells. And for most of them, it's fat based, right? They make up the membrane. They also make up the white matter, which kind of like fat makes up the white matter, which insulates our neurons. And so this is where omega-3s and homocysteine become really important. So probably one of the main fats in the brain, depending on the region of the brain, it's somewhere between like 15 and 25% of fat in the brain is DHA, which is a long chain omega-3 fatty acid that you generally get from seafood. And if you want it to be in the place that it needs to be, which is either in the synapses where the neurons talk to each other, or in the mitochondria, which are responsible for producing energy, they exist in something called a phospholipid, which then sits in that membrane. And a phospholipid is essentially this head group that's then attached to the DHA. And that head group is made up of something like either phosphatidylcholine, which and choline, and we get that generally from eggs. And it can also be other types. So actually, most DHA exists as phosphatidylserine and phosphatidylethanolamine. And you don't really need to remember any of these things. You just need to remember that in order to create these head groups, you need methylation to work. You need your methylation system to be functioning. And when your methylation system is impaired, homocysteine goes up, which is why homocysteine is an important risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. And it seems to be for two reasons. One is because it's telling you don't have a functioning methylation system, which means that you can't undergo the metabolism you need to have everything be working properly in terms of cells in the brain. But then also because it may homocysteine itself may be directly damaging, both to the blood vessels and to neurons. So it's kind of like this double-edged sword, or it's all bad almost. And so there are several studies now that show if you lower homocysteine, you can slow the rate of brain atrophy or brain shrinkage, and you can slow the rate of cognitive decline and risk of dementia, but only if you have enough omega-3s. You can't just fix one and see benefit. And they've actually done the opposite, which is that if in randomized controlled trials where they supplement with omega-3s, you only see benefit if your homocysteine isn't elevated. And this is really tricky because there are lots of people, and including, some of those papers I mentioned earlier who estimate how much risk can be prevented. They don't include homocysteine as a risk factor, and often they don't include omega-3s as a risk factor, because there are lots of trials where they didn't show benefit by acting on homocysteine or omega-3s. But when the only time they do show benefit is when you're addressing both at the same time. So it's when we kind of try and isolate these individual risk factors we might see no effect because we haven't appreciated the other things, the other context that's really important. So that's why, it's not just you tick these boxes, right? You need to make sure that everything's kind of being addressed in a holistic manner.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I actually had the benefit of getting my blood work not that long ago and being interested about it and getting the advice from somebody. My homocysteine levels, I think at the time, were 12.7, and this was probably just 4 or 5 months ago. And because of that, I've started taking Thorns, methylfolate, and B12. And hopefully when I go get it retested here in a little bit, it's going to be gradually working its way down. What would be a good level for homocysteine to get to, or to be at, or a healthy level?
From a cardiovascular disease standpoint, some people target fairly low, like 8 or 9. I think the evidence is a little bit mixed on that. For the brain, the target is probably less than 11. So if you didn't have quite enough B12 or folate, riboflavin and B6 are the other 2 B vitamins that can affect homocysteine. If you're taking a good quality multi-B vitamin, and any of those were an issue, I'd be very surprised if you didn't get under 11 with supplementation, which would be the goal.
Awesome. Well, yeah, I mean, I'm somebody who I feel like is super healthy, but it's things like that knowing that at 29 years old is super, super beneficial, and something that I can start taking action on and start taking preventative measures here pretty quickly. This has been absolutely awesome. I don't want to keep you too much longer, but I do want to finish with the basically healthy metabolism side of things. I've heard people talk about Alzheimer's or dementia labeled as type 3 diabetes or as insulin resistance of the brain. Talk to us about how accurate that may or may not be. Is it actually insulin resistance of the brain? Is that something that's actually a causation, or is it something that's just like after somebody has it, that's what is experienced? And from a nutrition standpoint, well, let's just say there, is that an accurate assessment that it is to be called insulin resistance of the brain or type 3 diabetes?
Yeah, this is super interesting, and I think in reality, it's type 2 diabetes is probably not correct. And that's because we've already talked about a whole host of other things that can contribute to cognitive decline that aren't related simply to blood sugar and insulin resistance. However, insulin resistance is a significant risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. And there are multiple ways to look at this, but one that's maybe the easiest for people to implement themselves is to look at their HbA1c, which is a measure of long-term blood sugar control. And there are studies that show that essentially the higher your HbA1c, the faster your cognitive decline, even after you adjust for a whole bunch of other like risk factors and confounders. So you essentially want to not be pre-diabetic, which sounds like should be like an obvious goal, but probably the majority of US adults now are pre-diabetic. So the goal is to not be that. Have an HbA1c less than 5.7%, and a fasting blood sugar at least less than 100. That's the goal. And the reason why the Alzheimer's disease has been labeled type 3 diabetes, or one reason why, is because when you look at the brains of people with Alzheimer's disease and cognitive decline, they take up less glucose. You can do a fancy scan called a PET scan, and you can look at how much glucose is getting into the brain. Then we know that if cells are insulin resistant, less glucose gets in. So we assume that the brain in this state is insulin resistant. However, there are some really nice old studies that show that if you increase cognitive demand and you stimulate the brain, even in early Alzheimer's disease, the brain will take up more glucose. So it's not that glucose can't get in. At least part of it is that the brain just isn't asking for it. It's not being used, and therefore the decreased, when you say less glucose is getting to the brain, you can't tell the difference between how much the brain is asking for versus how much is able to get in. And there are studies that show that if the brain asks for more glucose by being cognitively stimulated, you can still get glucose in. So which is why, again, I think cognitive demand and challenge is so critical, because even if you have some early cognitive decline, you can still reverse some of that process with cognitive challenge. So blood sugar regulation, insulin resistance, metabolic health, super, super important. But it's just that exact moniker of type 2 diabetes, which is maybe not quite correct.
Yeah. That was such a great distinction, though, of it's might not necessarily just be insulin resistance that might be part of the issue, but the brain actually just might not be challenged to the extent to where it needs that glucose and draws that glucose in. That's awesome. This has been an absolute blast and super educational, and I bet people are taking notes and are just wanting your book to be out now. I know I can't wait for your book to be out, called Future Proof Your Brain. Y'all need to make sure you follow him on Instagram at Dr. Tommy Wood, and he has a website, drtommywood.com as well. Is there any other good place that people should go learn more about your work?
Yeah, two things. One is I have a new Substack with a colleague of mine, Dr. Josh Turkner, who's a neurologist. If you just go to betterbrain.fitness, you get the Substack is free. You can sign up. The first thing that you'll get in your email is a PDF where I've listed out all the blood tests, like a whole bunch of new blood tests you can track that are easy to get from your doctor, like nothing super fancy. Targets that you should target, and then the nutrients. So we talked about B vitamins, we talked about omega-3s, there's a few others. All of that is in that document that you'll get. And then I also have a podcast again with Josh called the Better Brain Fitness Podcast. It's like question and answer. So if you have a question, you can submit it online, and then we answer the questions in the podcast. So hopefully, if I haven't addressed something today, you can ask us there, and then other people can benefit hopefully from the answer as well.
Awesome. I'm getting ready to go download this thing right when we finish. To finish off today, give me 3 daily and or weekly habits that you do to future proof your brain.
Yeah, so the main ones for me that I've found to be really critical, one is obviously I try and challenge my brain, both with my work but learning new skills. One is I do a lot of coding, and that's something that I've been doing relatively recently. And coding, when you stimulate the brain with coding, it looks a little bit like learning a language, but also does some other things. So that's one new skill that I'm constantly trying to learn. And then also in the gym, I try and do new movements. I compete in strongman, so trying to do some of these complex movements. So challenging my brain, still super important. Sleep is just a major one for me. Like the day almost gets organized around when I can then get into bed. And the way that I do it is I know when I'm going to get up. The dogs get up at 6. So if I then want to spend 8 hours of sleep, I probably need 9 hours of sleep opportunity. So I need 9 hours in bed. So I need to be in bed by 9. And then from there, I don't want to like have eaten right before bed, because I don't sleep as well if I'm still like full from dinner. So then I eat a couple of hours before then. Right. So then the day kind of works back from there. But then the final thing that I think is important, and it's something that I've worked on because I haven't always been great at it, is acknowledging that like sometimes stuff goes wrong. Sometimes you don't sleep as well as you thought you were going to sleep. Sometimes you don't manage to get to the gym. Like sometimes you can't get the food that you want to eat. And just remembering that our brains and our bodies are incredibly resilient, right? We do the things that I've talked about most of the time, right? Your 80-20 rule. If you do those things 80% of the time, maybe 90% of the time, then that will allow you to perform at your best even when you can't get everything right. Rather than the other thing which kind of happens in the world of optimization and biohacking is we assume that everything has to be perfect all the time so that we can perform at our best. And that's just an unrealistic expectation. That just doesn't happen. So build resilience through these things that we talked about. So then when everything goes wrong, just be confident that actually, do you know what, you're in pretty good shape and you'll perform just fine.
Oh, I'm really glad you finished it that way, because I think a lot of people on here are people who are high performers and hold themselves to a high standard, and they think that if I don't hit all of these markers, then I'm stressed out because I'm not hitting their markers. And then the stress that they experience because they're not hitting the markers is actually more detrimental than them not hitting the markers themselves. So I appreciate you finishing with that. So you guys I'm getting ready to go do this right now. You need to go to betterbrain.fitness to download that Substack of PDFs that will tell you the blood tests that you can get, the targets that you should look for, the nutrients and different things like that. And you should check out their podcast as well, Better Brain Fitness. And then I'll have to let you know when the book comes out, and we'll have to see if we can get Dr. Tommy back on to talk more about his book when it comes out. But this was an absolute blast today. You guys make sure you follow him on Instagram as well, Dr. Tommy Wood. But Tommy, that's all we got today, man. Thanks so much.
This is great. Really, really appreciate your time. This is a lot of fun.
I am so fired up after that interview. I loved learning more and more about how I can take ownership over my long-term health. And that's exactly what Dr. Tommy taught us how to do today. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcast app, make sure you guys hit follow. And if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you hit subscribe down below, because we're continuing to put out some of the most life-changing content out there to help you achieve your health and fitness goals. Some of my biggest takeaways today from Tommy were the following. Number one, only 10% of the total risk of Alzheimer's is determined by genetics. So take control over your lifestyle to mitigate the other 90% of risk. Number two, embrace cognitive challenge. We need to work our brain like a muscle. If we want our brain to have elite level of performance, then we need to challenge it with tasks that are difficult for us so that we can improve our cognitive function and long-term brain health. Number three, what's good for the heart is good for the brain. Improving our cardiovascular health by keeping our homocysteine levels down and doing cardiovascular training is key in keeping our brain healthy. And be sure to get plenty of DHA and EPA omega-3 fats by eating fatty fish and or through supplementation. Fourth and finally, sleep is critical for brain health. Organize your schedule such that you can get sufficient sleep, get exercise for better sleep, and partake in new cognitive challenges leading to more deep sleep. Life-changing. I mean, this episode is absolutely life-changing. Now it's on you. It's on you to implement what you've learned today, to embrace cognitive challenge, lower your homocysteine levels, take in omega-3 fatty acids, do cardio and strength training, get proper sleep. If you can do these things, you can dramatically decrease your risk of Alzheimer's disease and therefore continue on the path, getting closer and closer to your best you.